Welcome back to another episode of Hacker Hangouts. This one I am freaking pumped about because we're talking about just how do you really break down and plan a hack when you come across something just random. And this is an interview question which I've come across a lot. It's one that I've asked a lot of times, which is you walk into a room and you see a black box sitting on the table and go. How do you hack into it? How do you break into it? How do you find out what it's doing? And I love this question because every hacker approaches it just a little bit different based on their background, and you get to see them kind of flex the mindset. And the reason why I'm so excited with doing it as on this podcast is because we have 4 really, really different perspectives here with all different backgrounds. Now, we haven't done this in a while, and I want to just go around the room. What would you say your core competency is? I know we all have a little bit of different backgrounds, but Gator, what would you say like your core competency? I know like you have all of us have very diverse hobbies and backgrounds, but like what would you say like your core competency is when you would approach this question?
So I would go looking at the physical side of the house and seeing if it was network connected and say, hey, I'm more the simpleton. Try to start really basic.
Let me rephrase the question. It's like if you were saying like I'm a network architect, I'm a reverse engineer, I am like, where would you say your skill set would be?
That's a hard one, Silk. I'm the jack of all trades and master of none when it comes to, hey, I've got certain tooling, and I like to be able to try to use the methodologies that I've learned over time to see if I was going to look at this box. How would I attack it? I would start with going through and saying what ports and protocols are open, what services are currently there. Is it physical or is it something I'm just doing online?
We're not there yet. I'm gonna pose the question because I think that you're getting into that breakdown section where we're not even to the point. We haven't even approached the box yet. So like before we jump into the fact that thing's powered on, and I'll lay some groundwork. I just wanted to get like what is your core competency, Gowrie? You're muted.
You're muted, bud.
Well, technical difficulties. So my my core competencies, I'm largely a virtualization developer, although what that means in practice for something like this would be that I have a lot of operating systems and embedded systems, like real-time operating systems, exposure and internals knowledge. So that's sort of the the perspective that I would bring to this approach, and being able to identify, what hardware is being run, what we can expect from the architecture, what tools we would need to use to either, pull firmware off and emulate the firmware in, another environment, things like that, so that we could examine and reverse engineer the software on the box.
Okay. What about you, Gulo?
I'm Batman.
Lovely.
I'm whoever I need to be for whatever challenge it is that's placed before me. If I don't know how to do it, I learn it. I'm Batman.
I think
like
that's fair. I mean, for me, I'm going to be more on the application stack. Again, I've always been the pen tester, so properly, we'll say, scoping out what the problems are, splitting those things in. I am a little bit of a jack of all trades, but my focus has always been on, I want to say pen testing, but that's really wide scope. I would say on the application and on the service side is probably where my strong suit is, but I've done a little bit of everything across the spectrum, because reverse engineering I've done. I know some assembly, I know quite a bit of coding, but mostly is like setting up the fuzzers and things like that. But let's pose the question, which is, you enter in the room. Let's call it a DEF CON competition, or like something you would come across at a contest. The reason why I say this is because if you were approached on, let's say, a gig where you're pulled into a system where you want to like dump running memory or things like that. Cool. I wanted to make sure that we weren't having any technical difficulties. But if you hit this point where you walk into the system, you're not having to like rip memory right off the fact that it's running. But okay, you walk into the room, you see the system sitting on the counter, and you don't see it plugged in or anything like this, but it is sitting on, let's say, a closed cabinet. What is the first steps you would take to start figuring out what the system is, what's on it, what it's doing?
So in my case, okay, can I go over there and carefully lift up the box to see if there are connections underneath going inside of this table? This thing's got to be powered somehow, or is it a wireless laptop? We have no idea. Is it the internet, and we need to be careful not to break it with the blinky red light on top?
It's the entire internet.
The entire internet, right? It's wireless, right? No, be able to first start with that on the physical side if there are any connections. Secondarily, I'd probably bring out like a Wi-Fi pineapple or a hack RF to be able to see if there's radio spectrum, something going on there, emanating from this thing with a very strong signal is what I'd probably start with.
Okay, so let's say you look underneath the box, you open it up, you see that there's power, there's Ethernet, so it has connection into it. Now, it's not plugged into anything on the other end. It's plugged into the wall, but the Ethernet is still just dangling there.
Oh, so it's not plugged into the box yet?
Nope, and we don't even know if
you could have
powered on.
You could have Ethernet over power, right? Like, just because it's plugged into the wall doesn't mean it's not connected to something.
It's a good point. So, like, what would be the steps that you might take?
Yeah. So my first approach and my first question to these things is always, what's our risk tolerance to losing the black box, if you will? Is it our only black box, or is there an entire, cabinet? Is the cabinet below it full of replacement black boxes because they're expecting them to break, right? And, do we lose if it breaks, or do we get a replacement? That's always step one, because if you're going to take something apart, you should always assume that there's a risk to breaking whatever it is that you're playing with.
I mean,
that's go ahead.
Oh, no, I was going to say, you bring up a really good point, because something I learned from Bunny with, I think it was like the old blue boxes, is when you unscrewed them, they had tamper evident features in them. So like when you opened them up, it would rip traces out of the board, and the board would effectively break. And there's a lot of these like physical security things that are tamper evident protections that will break the boards when you open them, when you unscrew the things and start opening them. I think even some processors have this too. When you start opening the processors, you will start breaking them. So, and
it gets really complicated. In fact, DEF CON has an entire tamper evident village to explore that exact thing, right? So, at this point, it's not going to be any fun to talk about, like, let's do the tamper evident approach to everything in theory. So the thing that I would suggest is we start to approach it and we look at it. Well, let's just assume there's no anti-tamper. If there is anti-tamper, it's going to be relatively simple and non-destructive. We're going to get access into the box. We're going to be able to look at the chips. We're going to be able to do all these things. So just for the sake of being able to progress into somewhere interesting, let's make that assumption. Again, you said like it could be plugged in, it may not be plugged in. If you have to ask the question, if it's not plugged in, or if it is plugged in, rather, is unplugging it going to cause it to become non-functional in its entirety? Are you going to lose some functionality because you need a crypto key to it's got BitLocker or something on it, and if you unplug it, you shut it down, and you're no longer going to have access to the unencrypted disk, right? So you have to make that assessment, and let's just assume that's not necessarily there, because we want to be able to dump the firmware off the disk or off the chip, whatever the hell's inside of it, right? So first step for me is open it up and start identifying every single chip on the board, down to the processor and the RAM and all of that.
So I want to ask a question for somebody who hasn't done this before. Is you open it up, what information, you say like identify the chips. How do you do that? Like what information are you looking on the chip? What happens when you just get a chip which might not have a lot of information on it? Like which part are you grabbing to search, and then what tool are you using to search?
Yeah, so you're using your eyes, by and large, maybe a magnifying glass of some kind, if the chips are really small, corrective lenses if your eyes aren't so good, things like that. But like this portion of it, people like to think like, or people tend to get the idea that part of this is complex, but to be honest, you're just looking for serial numbers for the most part. You open up, you pull up, whatever hardware is in there, and you start going piece by piece and looking for each individual serial number, because some things look like processors and they're just like a giant DRAM. Some things look like maybe like a little transistor, but it might be an entire embedded FPGA or something like that, or not transistor, but like a transmitter. But it might be an FPGA. So you really have to go from like chip to chip and start to break down what is it that is on here. And if it's like a really super secret squirrel black box or something like that, a lot of cases like they'll use off the shelf hardware like an Intel chip or an AMD chip or whatever, and they'll just scratch the serial numbers off, right? Like that's a thing they've done in competitions before as well to help obfuscate what's going on. But a lot of times it's really difficult to scrub an entire board of identifying information unless it's a custom-made board and you have the ability to basically not print any of that information. So typically, if you're not able to identify a processor on a board, you might be able to identify the board. And if you can identify the board, you'll be able to pull up the information sheet for that board, and you'll know what processors could slot into there, whether it's a PowerPC or an Intel chip or whatever. And so you can start to piece this information together. Sometimes it's a little bit of a puzzle, and you have a question like, oh, it could be any of these 12 chips that are in here, and you just got to move forward with what's the commonality between them, and we'll work from that basis.
One thing I'll mention is in a competition, the other thing that we tend to do is when we're looking at this and we have a bunch of people grabbing information, having that in a centralized place, like whether it's a shared Google Doc or something like that, is incredibly important. Like was it NordSec, the NordSec CTF, when I was doing that with Malort, where we just used Notion because it was great. You'd have everyone in there and actually start creating a parts list, and here's the different competition, here's the different servers, and here's what the services are. So we don't have like 15 people mapping the server. We just had all the information. So having basic shared docs usually helps with a lot of this.
So shared docs and documenting as you go along the way is important, because if you don't go through and a document as you go, you may miss a step that you are going through and doing, or that you need to revert something back either.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. One thing to note here is when you open these boxes, things are pretty good now about being pretty well shielded, but you don't want 15 people handling the hardware ever. So you have whoever's going to need to do this step, do it, and take pictures. and then close the thing back up, unless you're gonna, drop JTAG or whatever on it to be able to debug it live. Because like get a nice camera, or even like a decent camera phone that can zoom in a bit, take pictures of every quadrant of the chipset, and close the thing back up, and then do your your reversing tasks on the pictures, because every person who handles it, every time you touch one of those chips, is another chance to electrostatic shock it, right? So if it's a precious board, don't handle it. Like, leave it in its chassis, and don't play with it like it's a toy.
What else would you do when we have the box open? Let's assume like you go through it, you found like some Bluetooth, like it looks very much like a normal system. It has Bluetooth modules, it has a Wi-Fi chip in it, it has just normal connectivity in there. What else would we want to do?
The only other thing that I would do in this step is I'd identify all of those chips as best as I could, and the makers and all those things, so I could understand what the likely firmware or the drivers are on there. But I would also look at the hardware to figure out if there is JTAG pins exposed, or like headers exposed that might give me a serial terminal, or if there's a serial port on there already. Any way that I can hook into the box that isn't obvious from the external ports. In a lot of cases, an Intel chipset may not have the JTAG pins exposed directly. They may have pulled those off the board after they went through their prototyping phase. So if those aren't there, then you got to find a different route in, and we'll talk about that as we get there. But that's basically where I would stop, and move on to the next step.
The other thing I would do is, if I open it up and let's assume it's not powered on, because if it was powered on at that point, I would want to, depending on the contest or depending on what the scenario is, whether I dump the running memory and pull information that way. But the first thing I would do if it was powered off is also yank the drive out and do a DD on it, pull all the data off.
Yes.
Yep. So you grab that, and then that's one of your first artifacts that you have, which you can hand off to the team. You can run strings. You can see, is it what type of format the drive is. Is it like Riser FS? Is it ext4? Is it NTFS? Because that's what is the OS, and that's going to start giving you extra information. Also, again, at this point, you run strings and just pull any flag that is just like sitting there.
Again, important to note, though, that you don't do that until you know that unplugging the box will not prevent you from accessing the box, right?
Exactly. So RAM or whatever else. Yep.
Yeah, you need to take a second to examine the actual run state of the box if it's plugged in, to make sure that you're not going to lose access due to encryption.
And on top of that, once we have physical access to the box, there's a whole host of tools, whether it's Hack5 gear, whether it's stuff from the Hacker Warehouse. There are tools for the physical touching and gathering of data. So when I heard that the Ethernet was not plugged in, can we plug that in? Is that part of in the scope or not? Because we could absolutely put like a plunder bug or a LAN tap in between and make sure to copy all the data off to a spare port and be seeing what the traffic is going on there. Like what you said on doing a DD, you can use Clonezilla. There's other forensic programs or docs that you can also use to be able to do a one-to-one copy. And then if you keep that original off to the side, you clone your clone again, and then start handing that off to folks for them to start working on. And if you want to do it virtualization versus whatever else, you have that opportunity to do so. So there's a slew of tools when we're talking physical, but if we want to use one of the clones, boot the thing up, if we can go through and capture as much of that information while it's going live, whether you're grabbing the logs from that, whether that's a bash bunny or whatnot, to be able to send that out to another connection, or that plunder bug or whatever else in between, you need to start capturing data at this point.
I think we lost an opportunity to actually just like play the song "Let's Get Physical" as we jump into the box. I think at this point, though, let's say we've gathered all the information. We know there's like Bluetooth. We know there's Wi-Fi. We still have the Ethernet cable, which isn't plugged in. Do we power it on at this point? Have we gathered enough information where we want to power on the box?
So at this point, I would do one more thing, Silk. There is a tool that you can use to dump what's currently in the RAM onto a thumb drive. Depending on how much RAM that you have, you can do a cold boot attack, or at least get about 95% of what's in the RAM onto the thumb drive. So I would do that before booting it up for the first time.
Okay. So we pull the RAM. We have that information. We have a couple artifacts where now our team is off researching some of these chips. With it being a contest, typically we just keep moving forward as quickly as we can and get to the next step while that research is being done. In a more professional, let's say if it was like an actual assessment, we have time on our side typically where we're going to want to do that research before we, let's say, move on. At this point, do we turn it on? And what things would we want to do before we turn this box on? Make sure a monitor is plugged in is probably a big one.
I mean, all the simple stuff. But yeah, no, I think it's time to turn the box on and see, what's running and what we can get access to.
Okay. So we kick it on. What do we do with that Ethernet cable? Do we plug it in at this point, or would you cold boot it without any network connection?
Always examine the external hardware before you plug it in. You've got things like monitors can actually communicate back with operating systems and send keys in. You have keyboards that could have special things. So another movie quote, I disassemble Johnny 5. I will disassemble anything around me, the cabinet, the system, the keyboard, the monitor, pretty much everything, because I want to make sure that I know what everything actually is before I move forward. As far as plugging in the Ethernet cable, I won't plug in that Ethernet cable. I would probably plug in a crossover cable or plug in my own network cable to it and examine the traffic just to see if it's trying to pixie boot. Is this a dumb terminal that there's absolutely nothing on the hard drive and it needs to do a network boot off of something else? Yeah. So I won't even plug in that network cable to that system. I'll plug in my own network cable to see what the system requests. If the system doesn't request anything, I'll probably plug that network cable into my laptop or into my network and then do scans to see what's actually being broadcast on that network before I connect that system.
Now, to that same point on what you're talking about, Gulo, so Landstar or whatever else, I would go one more step as well and either use the Landcrab or use another external capture card that you can put in between, much like what you would do for game streaming. Because if you're recording what's going on screen before the operating system boots up that's completely outside of it, you can capture all that data as well, whether it's for screenshots or whatever else.
I agree with that, but I don't want that system communicating on that network until I know what's happening on that network.
Right.
So I would do HDMI. Everything.
I'm just talking about HDMI. I'm just talking about HDMI, not necessarily the network. Yeah.
So I think that is an important piece that Gator pulls out is like anything you can record and create an artifact of, and an artifact is like anything that we need to do research or reconnaissance on. Anything you can record, anything you can capture, storing that off, because especially in contests, there is some goofy places you can put flags, and often that can be like it takes research, or there's pieces of information that you gain earlier in the contest that you're going to need to use later. So anything you can record and store off is great. One of the things that we've talked about a little bit is you don't need like these, what do you call it, the Ninja Star Ethernet thing. Like often, if you just have like basic switches, you can set up a spanning port, which is duplicate everything you have on this over to this. The other thing which is really complicated with a system like this, where you don't really know what it's doing, is you have to treat it as untrusted. You're not going to just plug it into your home network, which I think we all can acknowledge. But the other thing is there might need to be supporting systems for this thing for it to function. Do I need a DHCP server handing it an IP address in order for it to act out? Is it not going to boot properly unless it has internet connection? And these are things this is where Gowrie brought up a good point is we need to know a little bit more about this box of like, if I boot it up and I have to if I unplug it and reboot it in, am I going to lose data, or am I allowed to restart this thing as many times as I want? Because the first time I would want to do it is start it without network connection, gather that information, restart it, give it no IP address and network connection, give it an IP address and see what it's reaching out to. So let's pause here. Before we move on and we've kicked on the box, before we give it network connection, is there any other steps we want to cover before we now jump into like what are we looking on the network side?
One of the things for a network that you have to pay attention to, yes, you can set up spanning ports, but spanning ports usually have limitations to them. So if there is a crap ton of data that system is pulling, then you're not going to be able to record that through a spanning port in some instances. Most instances, there's not enough data to overflow one of those, but they are easily overflowed.
I also want to point out that just because it's an Ethernet port doesn't mean that it speaks Ethernet. You never know. You could end up dropping all kinds of data if you go through a spanning port if it's talking serial over Ethernet, right? Mm-hmm. Or like it's so that something to remember with external interfaces is an external interface is just wires. Right? You can pump whatever data you want over those wires in whatever format you want. You can open up a raw socket and just send bytes over the wire without it having anything to do with the TCP IP stack whatsoever. Mm-hmm. So something to note, if you're going to go through like a spanning port, you probably do actually want to plug this directly into some kind of capture device just to see what it shoots out the port, just to validate that, yeah, it's speaking TCP IP or, whatever.
Mm-hmm. On the other side of things, and I've done this before, you can rewire network cables. You can change them out. It's a pain in the ass to do, but you can totally do it. So you can also fry your gear as well if you're plugging it in and you're not expecting 5 volts to hit your ground wire on an Ethernet cable. So paying attention to those types of things before you start connecting in random cables to your gear. It comes back to disassemble everything. Along the lines of booting and network serial, this could be an iSCSI boot. So it could be the hard drive exists somewhere else and it's having to stream all of the hard drive commands, all the SCSI commands over that. And now you just have raw SCSI commands that you're having to look at, or even encrypted SCSI commands if they're running something like chat.
That's a good point. I mean, and that's the thing is you don't really know what this is, and this is why you do the reconnaissance or like looking at the chip. Let's take the next step forward. Is we've set it up. We have now turned the box on. We have gotten to that point. Is we've kicked it on. Do we give it? We have checked out the networking. Let's assume it's just TCP/IP. We've given it an IP address. What are the next steps that we want to do? We want to monitor its traffic, I would assume. What else?
What's the booting logo, right? That's going to tell you a lot about what your next steps are. Are we talking about Solaris? Are we talking about old school DOS? Are we talking about Windows, Mac, Linux? Because there's a whole bunch of different options here when it comes to now how are you going to deep dive inside the box? That's different specialties per location. Methodologies are the same, but tools are going to be different.
Before that, I would try to crack into the BIOS to see what the BIOS is doing and see what the boot order is. Is it, yes, it has a hard drive. Yes, it has a network cable, but does somebody have a USB something plugged into it somewhere weird that it's set to boot off the USB and all the others are red herring? So cracking into the BIOS.
This actually brings up a good point.
BIOS versus UEFI as well, because that's also going to tell you if they've got older gear turned on and using, or if they may have BitLocker. Because hey, if you got BitLocker up and running, it's not going to be easy for you to try to boot into a Windows machine and pivot to the BitLocker partition versus if it's a Linux machine on whatever partition. So your BIOS will depend on how far you're able to go as well.
Gowrie?
I was going to say the other thing you can do if you have BIOS access, mind you, like a lot of times BIOS or UEFI has a password on it. So otherwise, like what you can normally do if you have BIOS access is skip the hardware reversing step and just go right into the BIOS and look at what it is. But I mean, I was
going to say most times the password can be easily reset though. Like you go put the jumper. Yeah, go put the jumper on a specific spot, reset it. Now, here's the kicker is the moment you reset the password, typically it will blow away all your settings in the BIOS, so that's going to be a risky one. Nice. Cheers from Romania. Nice to have you.
Based off of that, it's I'm assuming that there's an adult in the room that's going to prevent me from doing something like catastrophically bad to the system. And if not, then you don't know who your clientele is. So if this is a job interview, I'm assuming they're going to step in when I start to break things. But yes, pulling the battery on the BIOS or flipping the jumpers on the motherboard for it, those are all things to reset the BIOS. And those would be options that I may follow. I may not do it right away just in case it does break the boot order and I can't get into the BIOS. But that is definitely an option that is going to be on my to-do list to hit later of I want to go back into the BIOS and figure out everything that the system has and just reset it if it's password protected.
So here's what I'm going to say before we even get to the operating system. What I would recommend is assuming you can get a plug, a USB device plugged in, or assuming you have access to the networking cable, you can plug it in. You can make your own Pixie boot server, whatever. Launching your own operating system and taking a drive clone that way, or mounting the systems that way, and pulling off whatever you possibly can before you actually launch into the real software, so that you can have a copy of it to toss over to your reversing team.
Yeah, that was exactly one of the ones I was wondering if we were gonna hit on, is booting up into a live disk, jumping on that, mounting the drive, and pulling some clones that way. You get a lot more access and easier access that way too. Also, the moment you do this, if you find it's a Linux system, it's a Windows system, you can start pulling SAM and your security and your shadow files and your passwords and all of that. You can start jumping those and get those off cracking, so you can grab those.
Absolutely. So whether you're using Clonezilla for that purpose or any given operating system that you want, get a copy of that data across. Because for folks who haven't tried to go through and do this before, if you try to boot Windows and try to remove some of those System32 files or copy those, it's like, hey, stop that. I'm using those. You boot into a Linux, they're like, hey, this is just a file. I don't care. I'll copy anything that you want me to. So
yeah. That's going back to loft crack and booting in to reset the reg hives, to reset admin passwords, or figure out what users are on the system. Yeah, you'd mentioned DD at the very beginning. There's tons of tools out there to do that, but yeah, I would clone the drive, create an image of the drive, and if I have other team members, then I would be passing out those images like candy and be like, hey, go play with this and see what happens. Now, there are limitations to doing that in the fact that there are software licenses. If you look at any of like the Sentinel stuff, as you start looking at applications, they could have licensing that is specifically tied to that hardware. So it could be part of the challenge that software or whatever it is that you're looking for is only specifically tied to that physical hardware, and you would have to spoof stuff that you may not be able to spoof to fake out those licenses.
As a random segue here, I was so I've been doing this since college. Anytime I have to spoof the MAC address of my NIC card, did you know coffee is a valid MAC address? Because it's C0FFEE, C0FFEE. I don't know why. Lovely. That gives me so much joy, though.
That's
well. Now I know if I'm gonna fingerprint who's hacking me. If I see coffee, it's definitely Silk. Anywhere.
That's awesome.
So okay, we have now at this point. We have now cloned it. We have gathered information. Again, this is a theoretical box, so we're kind of jumping through this a little bit. Let's say it's a Linux system. We have identified we've booted into a live disk. We have identified it being a Linux system. Do we boot it up at this point, or do we want to split and say what kind of reconnaissance would we do with the live disk still booted before we start this thing up for the first time?
I don't know how to use Linux.
Okay. All right. So if it's Linux, you typically want to find out what users are on the box, what services are running, so you can go through and take a look. And you'll probably want to grab the shadow file as well.
Hey, we're not even there yet. You're not logged into the box. You may not have access to the drive. You could be in a live boot, but it might not. It might be an encrypted disk, and you might have to boot into the operating system, right? Like I think where we're at, unless you want to go the reversing route and like go into the actual drive images, that's one thing. But like boot the box, you get a login screen, right?
So if you're talking about a grub, if you're talking about a grub lock, then you'd either have to go through and try. If we've cloned the box already, there's going to be a limit to how much we can clone using these other programs versus Clonezilla is going to be a drive to drive. After that point, check the version of Grub, because there are vulnerable versions of Grub. Like about 4 years ago, if you just hit the space bar for 35 characters, all of a sudden, pop, you're now into and bypass Grub, and it continues booting. So first, find out which version of Grub.
The reason why I say this is because you have you have like root of trust systems now, right? Where the drive may be unencrypted during boot, but if you pull it out, it's encrypted at rest, and it validates that all of its settings and all of its environment is the same as it boots up, and then it'll unencrypt and it'll let you actually access the system. So the reason why I say this is just because you boot into a live disk doesn't necessarily mean that the disk is unencrypted. And just because the disk is encrypted doesn't necessarily mean that you need to have a BitLocker password to decrypt it. The keys might be on the box, for example, and there might be like a hardware root of trust system in place. So, I think where we want to sit though is just like the machine is on and you have a login screen is really, I think, where we want to be at this point.
So there's multiple levels on this on Linux, and I'll turn down my technicality on this then, because there are 2 logins depending on how you have Linux encrypted. You either have the group login, or for the very few folks who are actually doing network encrypted login, to where if it's connected to the network, it'll reach out, grab the key, and continue to boot to where you get to the user login. Depending on what Silk on the tabletop, what you're trying to go through and do here, what situation are you talking?
I would say at this point we were able to get into, let's say, with the live disk, because we're going to have to get to that point of, let's go down the harder route. It was encrypted. Live disk is hosed. You can't get into the system. At this point, I would say, I don't know why I'm looking at Gator right now. Let's move it back to me. By the way, again, lost opportunity right when we found out it's a Linux system. This is a Unix system. I know this. Like, I just think I need to get to the point where I can just throw GIFs into this thing. And again, it's GIF, Gator, not GIF. It's peanut butter.
I'll fight you.
So we've now booted this thing up. I agree with Gowrie. We are sitting at the login page with username, asking for a username and asking for password. At this point, we would have given it an IP address. We know it's a Linux system. We have given it, we set up a DHCP server. We have a spanning port or something sniffing, seeing if it has broadcast or any communication outwards. And we know what IP address it pulled. What's next?
So if you're at a logon prompt, you're either going to type in roots and then 1, and then roots and then 2, and then roots and then 3. Or I'm going to hop on the network and I'm going to start port scanning the shit out of this thing to figure out what applications it's currently running and hosting, because it booted. Systemd probably executed, and now there's services live on there. Does it have SNMP so I can do SNMP attacks on it? Can I set up traps for SNMP? Is it running a web server? What kind of web server is it running? SSH, blah, 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 blah. Does it have Telnet enabled? If it has Telnet enabled, thank the gods.
So we're fingerprinting it. So what versions are we in? What versions of software is it currently running? And we can do that with Nmap. If you're going to Apache, you can look at this freaking web server and say, hey, it's running Apache XYZ. You go over to exploit.db, and then you're like, oh, okay, let's see what we've got today.
There used to be, and I can't remember the name of this because I haven't done like pen testing work in so long, but there used to be a piece of software that was similar to Nmap that would actually do service fingerprinting. What is it?
Armitage. That was the GUI front end for Metasploit years ago.
Yeah. Well, I know Metasploit has it, but this was another like command line tool you could just apt install that ran very similar to Nmap. In fact, I think it was called something map, and it would go through and it would say again.
Zenmap or GUINAP?
Nmap can pull fingerprints. You can pull service fingerprints with Nmap.
They must have merged them then. So
yeah,
I mean, I've been doing this for like 15 years, so like a lot of this knowledge that I haven't done pen test stuff in like, I don't know, over a decade. So a lot of my knowledge as to like current applications is so ancient at this point.
It's like one of those ones. My day has come, Trebek. Like I'm like I have this one. I talk through it. Gulo though, like go on for it.
So Nmap Nmap can pull fingerprints. It can pull fingerprints of the OS. It can pull fingerprints of all the servers. It's been able to do that since, I think, release. But Nmap also has its own fingerprints. And if you compete in CTFs, you learn that you can't always use Nmap because there are tools out there that will fake out Nmap. So generally, depending on the complexity of this, you can make your own port scanning tools that will help you to do fingerprints that do slightly different things than what Nmap does or how Nmap does it, so that you don't get stuck in some weird loop where it's trying to fingerprint and you get different results every time, or Nmap takes 15 hours to run to scan a single port.
Yeah, we're getting into this whole category of what is it, Stump the Chump, where when you're doing these CTF competitions is how often do you have this thing messing with your tools? Because you will come across contests where it will purposely fingerprint, or you have weird services on different ports. And if you use the standard Nmap, like standard port thing, because it doesn't actually hit every single port, it won't pull on ports like 1337, or like these are really common ports that you see, 31337, like all of those ones you see in competition all the time. Or there's like, what was it, like 491 is actually called the flag port, which I've used in contests before. It's great. I think with some of these though, like you have to know, like you start getting that feel for the contest of whether or not this is a let's screw with the tester versus like this is an actual system you're testing, and you figure that one out pretty well. I think Nmap is fine. We Nmap the system. We find a slew of services running. I would argue though with you, Gulo, on Telnet. Just because Telnet is enabled, it doesn't mean you can log right in. You would still have to capture its plain text over the internet. But just because they have it open doesn't mean you would automatically exploit it and go in. Not that that's necessarily what you're saying, but I think we scan it. We notice that it's running SSH, it's running a web server, it's running a slew of other services. It has a port mapper on it, which you open up, and there's a ton of other things. You also notice ports that are going up and down. So we've now scanned this thing. We've started gathering information. What other steps do we start taking?
So on the Telnet piece, I know Telnet's not explicitly, well, actually, by now there's probably tons of hacks for it. I've not looked at it in forever. But one of the great things about Telnet is if it's enabled, then they may have like an HVAC system that's tied to it, or an old phone system that's tied to it that only communicates over Telnet. Because those old ass systems that never get updated use Telnet and don't have any other options. So seeing that that's open means that there might be something else that's trying to communicate with it that's dirt old, and you may just have to scan the network long enough to wait for a communication from it.
So this is actually a great example of how, like, a lot of times in this industry, things feel oppressively complex and difficult to figure out. And if you stick around in the industry long enough, you acquire such esoteric knowledge to be able to slot into things like this and be able to recognize, like, oh, this probably has some ancient component talking to it because I saw something like this a decade ago, right? It's a great example of how, like, just because you go through a million courses over the course of this year and get a certification in pen testing doesn't mean you're necessarily going to be effective right away without tons of field experience. Because, like, to be honest, I never would have thought about that. I never would have thought, if I saw Telnet open, that there might be an external service somewhere waiting to communicate with it. But it makes total sense, because if it's a system from the 90s, that's totally fair game.
Yeah, and
Did you just call me dirt old?
Yes.
I think that's one of the things that you do pick up is, as you said, you pick up all this knowledge, because especially on, I would say, like, on network testing, it tends to fit more into, we'll say, math and science. It's very straightforward. Network testing is, you even notice it in this conversation, is you pick it on, you find the IP address, you Nmap, you find services, you align those fingerprints to exploitable versions, you check to see if there's exploits for them. If you run like a vulnerability scanner like Nessus or Qualys, you scan those things, you acknowledge, okay, these are the vulnerabilities that it's affected by. Are any of those exploitable with any number of tools with exploit DB. I want to say Millworm. It's always going to be in my head. I hate that Millworm is no longer a thing. Exploit DB replaced it. I mean, you go through it those ways, where the web application sits more like in, we'll say, like the English class, where there's so much more opinion for it. Where with networking, you're looking at 680,000 vulnerabilities, which are all binary. Does it exist? Does it not exist? Within web application, you're looking for like 15, no, this is generalization, 15 vulnerabilities, a million different places. Cross-site scripting can exist a gazillion different places within the application, and it feels more like art or English. And it's not that one's better than the other, but you start pulling this back to what Gowrie said, is you start getting this sixth sense of like, this feels weird. When I log in and I see my own username, which I can control in the My Profile, and that shows up in the username in the top right dropdown, I start going, I have my own code that I can control within the username. I wonder if I can put my code in there to see if it will execute client side or server side or template injection and things like that. Gowrie?
So
or Gulo?
You let when you're working on the black box, it starts to tingle you?
I would say yes. I would say you get that sixth sense. Like you see this thing like where it's like, this is a little weird. I wanna go play with that a little bit. But I think, okay, we've scanned the system. We've scanned the system. We've noticed it's now running any number of services. What's the next step?
So
start poking and prodding.
Pump prod. I would go through and start off with saying, hey, what's scheduled, going to cron and finding out if something is reoccurring going on, what users are on the system, whether they have accounts or not. So
how would you do that though? How would you know what users are on the system?
Yet.
So
yeah, we don't. I don't know that we have access. Like, I don't know that we have access to the terminal yet. Like, we're still at the login screen, right?
Did we say that we were? I was going to say, so you can, depending on which Linux it is, there are ways for you to be able to go through and bypass the login, much like there is for Windows as well.
Give a couple examples of that. How would you go about getting access to a login?
So
beyond the login.
Beyond the login. So if you're on the Windows side, check out a tool called Conboot. That's one way to do it. Otherwise, you can use the live system rescue disk for you to be able to go through and overwrite the password file. I can talk more on the Red Hat side of the house.
Yeah, let's talk Linux. Because how would you gain access to an account on Linux? Because we said when we booted it up, you were at the login prompt. How would you go about getting into the system?
So if you're talking about, you need to identify what type of Linux that you're running, because that's going to depend on how you go through and log into the box. Red Hat has a different way than how you do it with Debian, has a different way than how you do it with Arch. So first you need to identify which Linux it is. Then you go into the administrator. So whether you have a spare box on to the side, go look at the man page for how you log into those boxes, because each one is going to be different. There are bypassing tools as well, but bypass tools versus using just the regular system admin to override or create yourself a new user on the box, you can absolutely do.
So how would you get into that account? Like I'm driving to is how would you reset that? So your one option I know of is like you're in Grub, you can select the recovery mode, and if they haven't set a root password on the box, that's going to let you jump into the box, and you can jump in as a root account at that point. Let's assume you go into that account. It's not there. You can't access it, or they've set a root password. You're still at the login prompt.
So you've got the Grub, you've got the recovery, but if you were able to take an image of it and it wasn't completely encrypted, you can root into it as well.
Yep. Absolutely.
And then you're just mounting things and digging through whatever at that point.
Yeah, and there's also like the important thing here is to understand what the intent is. Do we care about the hardware at all? If you don't, you can just pull the hard drive and put it in some other machine, right? And just if the intent is to get access to the disk and to be able to run the software and recover some flags, I don't know that it necessarily matters that it's on the real hardware. Now the assumption here is that like it matters because you have a black box and there's going to be some amount of checking there to make sure that you're still running on the system. I think where Silk is getting at to here is what some of the bypass stuff. Let's say none of that works and you can't just shove it in another box, or you can't bypass via Grub or the the default root password, things like that. Where do we go from there? We did the normal scans. We found like there's a web server, there's some applications running, maybe there's some services running, but there's no CVEs open, on any of those things, or at least not one that's going to give you remote code execution or a login bypass. What do you do? What's your next step? You got to we'll just toss the thing out. We have a web server and we have like a serial terminal that you can log into, but the serial terminal gives you just like another login prompt.
Mm-hmm.
Even my toaster is susceptible to log4j, so everything is.
Yeah.
It goes back to the versions of whatever software that we're running. You can also grab those files and start put them into a password cracking array. That is an option. Put that off to the side. Honestly, if you're already booted the box, you've got to log in. You've got services that are running. Most of the time, it's just finding the right software to be able to poke and prod at. So, you could start cracking passwords if that's the path that you want to take.
But even cracking passwords is going to require you to be able to access that drive and be able to dump files to pull the shadow file and pull the hashes that you can actually go off and offline crack.
We didn't necessarily say offline crack. Granted, offline cracking is way faster than online cracking. But you also have, so Gowrie postulated that there are no open CVEs, so start fuzzing it. What kind of crap can you send at those interfaces that are going to cause some overflow, some buffer, something to break in its tiny little computer brain that allows you to get at the sweet, juicy files?
But so this is where we get to be, you get into my area. This is where it's interesting, because if you just do blind fuzzing against the service, you're not going to get anywhere. You actually need the binaries to be able to determine like, oh, great, I crashed the system. How do I use that crash? Right? Is it just a null dereference, or did I actually overwrite some registers and overwrite something on the stack? Did I overwrite things on the heap? It gets to be really difficult if you're just doing blind fuzzing. Now, if you open up a browser and see that there's like an entire, let's just like take, for example, you open up the browser and you find out that it's like a WRT router that's in the box, and it's got the admin login page for the router. You obviously have a whole host of things that you could potentially send that are gonna, now we're looking at web hacking, right? Where cross-site scripting, all kinds of, was I able to capture an old session key, replay some sessions, things like that, to see if I can get access to configuration details that maybe are going to be able to expose a way into the box that isn't necessarily going to require me to go down the binary exploitation route, as opposed to just like bypassing. If I can get access to like the Apache account, that gives me at least user access to pull any number of things off of the drive, and then I can start looking for privilege escalation from there.
Yeah, I think you bring
I agree with that. There is one level between web server and actual binary dumps, and that is what is running on that web server. And I'm just going to use an example of PHP. If PHP is running on top of Apache and I fuzz the system and cause the PHP engine to crash, then Apache will now serve PHP files in clear text.
That's
and I can now view those.
I mean, I mean that depends on the configuration of the box.
It depends on the configuration of the box. It depends on how it would come up. We're now arguing a theoretical of a theoretical, because it depends how it will crash. So like, I'll pull us back here. I would double down on what Gowrie said. I wouldn't, like, fuzzing for me is like the Hail Mary of tests, especially when you're just like fuzzing haphazardly, because you're effectively looking for a 0 day at that point. You're saying like, I want to find a 0 day in whatever application this is. Now, sure, CTF and things like that, but like, I can't just like, okay, let's fuzz the web server by throwing random junk after the / Like, there's any number of more sophisticated, okay, I'm going to fuzz this parameter, or I'm going to send this data into this section, or this socket. Like, all of those things, like, are the big ones. I would go down the path of what Gowrie said. Is at this point, I have all the services. I now want to connect to every single web service, especially just using a browser. Can I connect to it? Is there a login prompt? Because while I don't have the username and password to the system, It might just be like an open WRT. I might just have admin, or as you said, an Apache service. Now, here's where the whole analogy might break down, because any one of these things might gain you a foothold into the system. If you find a Tomcat service with a username and password that you can log into, you can deploy a malicious war file, and then you gain your first shell. Any one of these things might lead down a shell, and this is where it just becomes, a lesson in futility. It comes down to like a battle of fruition where attrition, where I am going to sit there and I'm going to bash my face against the keyboard until I find my next foothold. And this, for me, I love this part, but this is the most frustrating one, because there is not here is the best way. Gulo, you look like you're about to loot like poop or something. What's up?
It's fuzzing.
No, that's not fuzzing. In no way is that fuzzing.
That's not fuzzing.
It's
fuzzing
you're
is literally
going through
just,
and you're running random tests until you can actually gain access to something. Now,
that's not
granted,
fuzzing. You can call it enumeration.
I completely agree that fuzzing is a Hail Mary and it should be a last resort. And the only reason I suggested it was because it was said that there were no open CVEs. But yes, there is figuring out what the applications are and then playing with each one of those applications to see if there's a misconfiguration, such as default passwords, default configurations, cross-site scripting, SQL injection, any dozen or hundreds of different tests that you could run.
I want to snag control here and say, like, we just spent 55 minutes explaining a methodology of how to approach a black box, right up until the point where we've now hit the theoretical boundary of what's actually on the system, right? And we can sit here and pontificate about, like, well, if it's a web service, if it's this, what if it's WRT, what do you have? Now we are at the point where, and this is a really good lesson to take away from this, is all of this methodology that we talked about up till now is pretty much going to be the same regardless of whether you're playing a competition or you're doing some kind of real assessment. Now, at this point, at this boundary, is where you have to start saying, we have 24 hours to crack this in the context of a DEF CON competition. What are the most likely routes that a contest organizer is going to have set these things up, because they want to make it solvable? So you start looking at the easy interfaces, and that's going to carry forward to a certain extent to real security work. But after a certain point, that breaks down, because this is one of the things that within the context of a competition, there's a vulnerability. Mm-hmm. Because it is there for people to solve. In the real world, you don't know that there's a vulnerability, especially if there's like no CVEs on the box or any of those things. And so while in the context of a competition, the idea is always to have momentum and always to be assessing something new and always to be trying to move and find that hole that's going to let you get access. In the real world, you could spend 6 months on this and get nowhere. Right. And that's why we're at this theoretical boundary where it's just like, yes, but what about this? And what about this? And what about this? And what about this? And in the real world, that's how it works. And that's why you'll hear us say a lot of times, like, you just spend your time bashing your face against the keyboard, because you just don't know. It's like what we would call the vulnerability research roller coaster, where you're just climbing endlessly, waiting for that drop on the other side, but there's no guarantee that there's actually going to be a drop. And then you find something and you get that ride down to the bottom and you go, wee, I have a thing. And then you get down to the bottom and you're like, oh crap, that doesn't get me everything I need. And so you start climbing again, and it takes another 6 months. And yeah.
It's the grinding of a video game. It's the boring stuff that you don't want to do, that you're going to forget.
Hold on. You say boring. I love this part. Like, this is my favorite part.
And this is like Jason drinking his coffee, and I'm waiting for the password to crack, and he's sword fighting in the halls with his coworkers.
What I love about this part, though, is, and this is where Gowrie hit it. This is the fundamental difference between a CTF, and this is one of the reasons, like, in some ways I love CTF, but I've stopped playing CTFs because it follows the same pattern. Where in real life, there might very well, there is no pot. There's no pot of gold at the end of the rainbow. It just is secure, and that's okay. There's no vulnerability there I'm going to find within my limited time frame. Sure, every system, given enough time, money, or resources, can be breached, but within my scope, within my time frame, within the 4 days at the conference, it's 100% secure. Or within the 4 days of this assessment, it's 100% secure. But at a conference, the moment, like, I was kind of laughing to myself, the moment you said it has Apache there and it has SSH, immediately I go, great, we're going to have to use Tomcat to upload some sort of WAR file to gain low-level access, to be able to gain, or not low-level access, to gain a user account. We'll use that user account to log into SSH, and immediately I go, okay, cool. Now that we've logged into SSH, there's any number of priv escalations that we can run. I'm not even going to, in a CTF situation, I'm not even going to bother researching any of it. I'm going to run any priv escalation tool, which is going to do all the reconnaissance for me, because that's going to be the first step, where it's automatically going to look through, any number of bash and sudo exploits. Most likely it's probably the sudo exploit, because that's the new hot thing. And actually, really, CTF this year, you want to solve every CTF at DEF CON this year, guess what's going to happen? You're going to exploit log4j. That's going to give you the first level of privilege.
Yeah.
You're then going to go log in, and then you're going to use the sudo exploit, because that's the new hot thing. And this is why CTFs, for the love of all that's good and holy, I love the darknet competition. Again, this is just us bragging about the competition that we do, is because it doesn't fit into that. Here is how to exploit paint by numbers. It's always a lot of like security through obscurity, stretching the hacker mindset. And I think that's where I want to close up this conversation, which is so many of these exercises, CTF, real life, is all about like thinking outside the box. I love asking this question during interviews because everyone approaches it differently. At one point, I asked the question this way. If I set down a laptop in front of you and I told you the keys to the kingdom was on that laptop for you to steal gazillions of dollars, and if you can do it, you get it, what steps would you take? And I was just, most people would say, okay, port scan, I banner grab, I exploit, blah, blah. I was waiting for anyone to say I would reach across the table, I would grab you and beat you into submission until you gave me the password. Like, this is the weird outside the box thinking I think we salivate over when you hear anyone talk. I love it. Like,
so early on, I was going to say, like, the next step, you're at the login prompt and you don't know what to do next. What I would do is plug in a nice little key logger to the keyboard and then go to the contest organizer and be like, hey, we recovered the password, but every time I log in, it reboots. Like, I don't understand. It seems like it's an actual fault. And you get them to log in and you're like, thanks.
Exactly. Like, this hits a whole nother point, which is like, at what point is it cheating in a hacker competition? Like, we know, like, at DEF CON, oh goodness, what was it? Like DEF CON 16 or something like that. During the CTF, they just hacked into the scoreboard and started changing the scores. Yeah. Like, forget about actually the contest. Let's just hack into the scoreboard.
Now, something to note, and I do want to like claw back a little bit of the negativity that Silk said for CTF. There are some exceptions. Like, the DEF CON CTF goes above and beyond of these typical CTFs, right? Like, sometimes they have custom architectures where you're dealing with 9-bit bytes and things like that, and you have to write custom lifters to translate that architecture's assembly into some other assembly. Like, that is a whole nother level of like rapid prototyping and testing. And like, the people who compete in those tend to have like 30 people on their team, and some of them are back at, Carnegie Mellon, for example, if you want to talk about PPP and stuff like that. So like, depending on the context within which you are in this assessment, whether it's like a DEF CON CTF or your typical regional CTF, or if it's just a normal security assessment, the question of like, how hackable is this box really is going to change. And it's one of the reasons why we say like CTF doesn't always carry over to you being an effective hacker, a professional hacker.
Mm-hmm.
Although it's a pretty good indicator, I will say. It's not a bad indicator.
I'll say this, and again, I'll pull back my own statement, which is, it's not that CTFs are bad. It's that the vast majority of them do, like, I would say the vast majority of them that I've played tend to follow these very similar patterns. And the reason why is because those are the patterns that match real life in some ways. Penetration testing can be very boring. Oftentimes, especially, I hit a string of assessments where I'm like, okay, cool, I'm on the internal network. All right, man the middle V. Like, we've gotten to the point where we've just scripted the whole thing. It's like, okay, pop up PowerShell Empire, man the middle V6, NTLMX relay. Okay, launch the PowerShell Empire script to then run. Okay, let's just point Death Star to PowerShell Empire and just let it take over, because, and then I'm gonna go have another cup of coffee, and then I'll come back and I'll have domain admin. Like, when you get too many of those assessments in a row, you just lose faith in all humanity, and you're like, well, Windows is terrible because it's not even exploiting at this point. This is just part of the functionality of the network.
It's not a bug, it's a feature.
Yeah, it's not a bug, it's a feature. And those are the ones that, like, kind of beat down your soul. And this is why we need CTFs, because all of a sudden you're like, wow, I get to do big brain stuff with CTF. And then the boring stuff sits into, like, the actual production network.
So at the same point, though, where if you started, my entire process on trying to get into the hacking culture was start with the lab, become a sysadmin, so you understand how things are built, and then you can start trying to put on the attacker mindset of how can I hinder, because you can't completely disable, how can I hinder the step processes that you would take as a hacker with this? And if you learn how to build it, then you know how to start mitigating it or throwing curveballs at whoever's attacking it then. So for me, that's been my path of going the admin side.
Or if you're like me and you've written an operating system, you just know everything is so hopelessly broken that you fall back to delete computers, return to monkey. Sorry, go ahead, Gulo.
And this is also where it comes back to the darknet. We're such oddballs. Silk has such a great understanding of pen testing that he can write excellent challenges. I'm batshit crazy, and whatever it is that I put into a challenge is logical to me, but illogical to everyone else in the world. Gowrie writes great exploitations, and Gator's always trying to get his wireless set up, while DEFCON's always trying to de-op his wireless.
Hey, I learned that by year 3. I learned that by year 3, man.
I'm going to give context.
I think that's enough tooting. I think that's enough tooting of our own horn, right?
Yeah, I think it is one of, you said it perfect, Gowrie, which is like, you have built an operating system, so you know how, like, some of the fundamental things, and it's I think, like, after doing pen testing for as long as I have, you realize that a lot of the vulnerabilities that really, like, completely open up networks are not, like, 0-day exploitation. It's simple things like someone stood up a MS SQL server, joined it to the domain, pulled the passwords from their running config and pulled them into Active Directory, which included, like, the default Microsoft MS SQL. And then they decided to move, like, 5 years later, move that network into Azure, and then it synced that stupidly weak password, and because it's Azure, it puts it into an Office 365 account, and they can't turn on two-factor because it's a group account, and all of a sudden you're like, oh, okay, we have a admin user with the user password, which actually gains access to an admin on a server, which had to be a domain admin for any number of reasons, because, like, these really weird, like, side things that end up, or these really weird, like, events that happen that open up the entire network, which are like due diligence exercises. Like, this is the reality of so much of pen testing is you roll your face across the keyboard and you talk about, like, the ride up. This is what's different, I think, between me and you, Gowrie, is you might have, like, a 6-month engagement. Mine is, like, oftentimes I'm finding I am looking for a needle in a haystack, and when you find it, it's like, here's the ride up. I'm looking for a needle in a haystack, and when you find it, you're like, and that's the entire network, like, in this one thing, which is not a rocket science, I bounced a laser off the moon. It's I found a weak password and I can now log into their domain controller.
Yeah, and the only thing I'll say is that, like, this is why I don't do any of this stuff anymore. Like I'm more or less just a forward engineer, software developer. I like developing features. I like developing systems, as opposed to trying to break them. It's just like, it's not, for me, it's not fun. For a lot of people, it's a lot of fun, especially if you get those short-term assessments. But, like, we just have fundamentally different skill sets now, and what I find fun is, like, architecting a system to provide features. Like I'd rather build the tools you're using to do all of this than to actually use them.
I think I have been finding myself doing a lot more development lately in building tools to actually like help us, our company internally of like presenting better data. And that I have been, again, Node.js and React. I'm sorry. JavaScript is fun for me. I'm sorry. Most people don't like it. It's a beautiful thing. It's going to solve all of our problems, just like Go and Rust. I'm becoming a Go developer now. It's terrible. All right. With that, I think there's a couple things we can still talk about, but let's talk about like hacker mindset. Gator, where does that fit in? How do you strengthen it? And what's the last word you got for us?
Hey, continue to be curious, learn areas that you haven't before, right? So when it got to the fuzzing part, that's where my knowledge stops, and then you guys can take over. Know your strengths, right? And then if you want to be able to get into these different roles, know where to go get resources. Hopefully we're one of them. Otherwise, there's a lot of different people on InfoSec Twitter that you can also follow to make sure to get that information. So stay curious and go love your hacker family.
Gowrie?
Delete computers, return to monkey.
Gulo?
I'm Batman. You can be Robin. If you don't know, learn.
With that, thanks for watching. Thanks for joining us on a Saturday morning. It was great. I'm glad we got to look into a black box, and hopefully you learned something. Thanks for watching, and hack on.